played a significant role and key role to destroy the Russian dominance in Black Sea, because after the February of 2022, Russians definitely wanted to occupy the total Black Sea and project the forces to Bessarabia and after this to Moldova. It was a plan, absolutely clear plan, of course preparing the blockade of Ukraine and after this they make a landing operation on Odessa. It was an absolutely clear plan on the February and March and April actually of 2022. But surprisingly, Ukraine done a good job in algorithm how to deoccupy the Black Sea. First of all, the destruction of the cruiser Moskva. It was a significant shock for Russians. And next it was a Serpent Island, already occupied by Russians, but Ukraine made a great job to deoccupy by direct artillery fire from the Ukrainian territory to Serpent Island. After this, the Special Operation Forces and military intelligence made a great job to deoccupy the Serpent Island, the gas platforms which were used by Russians to share the not only reconnaissance equipment, but actually to base Special Operations Forces to create the points of blockade of Ukraine. So after this, Ukraine started to use sea drones with different functionality, but the main function was a strike capability to destroy Russian Black Sea fleet. For now, we have approximately 30% destroyed. What is important, the strike capability of Russian fleets now absolutely less if we compare to February 2022. And what is important now, they don't have any strike capabilities in Crimea, so they shift all of ships to Novorossiysk. Now they have submarines and frigates and corvettes in Novorossiysk because of the Ukrainian sea drones and missiles, which is Ukraine using to destroy the Black Sea fleet, which is, from my point of view, and not only my point of view, should be destroyed totally. And after this, we could build a new Black Sea atmosphere and reality. Only after the destroying all of Black Sea fleet, and I'm sure that Russia cannot have any military force in Black Sea, because since 1991 we tried to build a free and prosper Black Sea with a lot of initiative from Turkey, from Russia actually, from NATO, from United States, for Ukraine, whatever. But Russia destroyed everything, and I think Russia doesn't have any rights to have a military fleet in Black Sea. A couple of words about the forecast. The forecast is that Ukraine assumed the Crimea and Black Sea as a center of gravity of this war. So not the Donbass, but center of gravity of this war is Crimea. If we have a blockade of Crimea, not the occupation, but if just the blockade of Crimea happened by Ukrainian forces, it will change the all of course of this war, and we will try to change the Russian position in case of continuation of this aggression against Ukraine. And actually the panel of the United States conservative was very interested in the case of this, because my opinion that we need to try to do it in 2024. Not after United States election, because definitely it was a clear positions of United States conservative that if Trump arrived to office, it will be an absolutely different reality, and it will be a very clear position toward Russia and Ukraine. And it depends on the positions on the land that time, land on the sea that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhailo, for this really interesting perspective on the asymmetric military dynamics in the Black Sea. The study is almost 100 pages long, and for good reason, because it tries to capture an incredibly complex situation that is unraveling in the Black Sea. And a big part of that is geoeconomics, subject which I know that it's very dear to Antonia. So perhaps, Antonia, could you tell us a bit about the importance of the Black Sea within the wider geo-economical regional matrix?
Sure, yes, the study is pretty thick. And we are proud of it. We invite you to read it. It has good detail, it has good maps, but it also have, or more It also has good information about what we think it will come if we consider that the Black Sea is the battle for the Black Sea is not over. So, geoeconomics. In the Black Sea, we have energy. It is known to you, it has been mentioned before, that Romania plans to develop energy in the Black Sea and to have that resource available for the European Union. That is an energy security element that obviously is under threat because the battle for the Black Sea is not over. Russia has been very much present and is very much aware of the competition that Romania would bring to the energy market with that kind of resource. And as you are very much aware, Russia hybrid warfare, not only in politics and not only in economics when it comes to nation state, but also when it comes to military tactics, which are very much detailed in this study, that have been going on prior to 2014 and have intensified since 2014 in the Black Sea, where we can also draw some important lessons, I might say, will likely come back if we consider that the battle for the Black Sea is over. So our proposal is to basically look at the threat that the energy project is facing, considering that Russia's main strategy has always been to take on the southern shore of Ukraine. And with that, I go to the next geoeconomic element of this, which is basically cutting into the trade corridors, which we all know are very much restructuring these days, and they are restructuring because of the global economic war that Russia has started by blockading Ukraine's ability to ship its merchandise to the global markets. So with that, we basically have had to adapt. We have a new corridor that is working, that is very close to the shores of NATO countries. But at the same time, we have a constant threat of this corridor not being necessarily very good and not sustaining functionality on the long term. One, because of the threat of the constant threat that Russia may take the southern shore of Ukraine, which will basically make it non-workable because Ukraine would not be able to ship its merchandise to the world. And second, because obviously we would have a crowded sea and Russia would effectively come close to Romanian shore, which is not something that Romania would want. Third element related to the corridors, to the trade and investment corridors, refer to the shape up of a new trade corridor from China to Europe, which is basically the middle corridor, which has been very much talked about as as a corridor that China first envisaged to develop, but now that we have an interest to develop, considering everything going on the northern corridor, that is not necessarily effectively sustaining the level of merchandise that we would want or support for that kind of corridor. So, bottom line, the Black Sea is becoming a geopolitical node, but also a geoeconomic node, in the sense that all threats here are creating a restructuring element elsewhere with regards to trade and investment. And I know we are short on time, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Antonia, for this really clear-cut sketch of geoeconomic dynamics in the Black Sea. And now I would like to take the discussion to a more strategic level and ask you, Matthew, about a seminal piece of strategy which will fundamentally alter security dynamics in the Black Sea for years to come. And my question is, what are the most critical elements that the new US Black Sea strategy should focus on moving forward?
Yeah, so thank you. Actually, maybe I should just, before I address your question, just actually step back a little bit and answer the question, why are we doing the study in the first place? Because quite frankly, I mean, there are so many conferences on the Black Sea and there are so many studies that have been published, and you think, in articles, etc. What else can be said that's new about the Black Sea? You want when you don't want to just write something that is the same as everyone else has written. Well, it turns out that actually there's an awful lot that has not been said about the Black Sea. And we think we've kind of described some of that here. There's that sort of famous German phrase, "Alles ist schon gesagt worden, nur nicht von mir," which means like everything has already been said, just not by us. But the point is that there is a lot of new stuff that we've actually come up with. We wanted to describe, for example, the Russian militarization of the Black Sea over the course of ever since 2014, because and Mihailo went into great detail on that question of exactly what is on what is on Crimea. What are the Russian assets that are on Crimea? How has Crimea been militarized? How has the Russian Black Sea Fleet militarized the Black Sea region? And showing maps over time, which quantifies and traces the development over the last 10 years in great detail. So number one, sort of characterizing and quantifying the militarization of the Black Sea, which is and then also to deal with such issues, and of course that development was very negative. It was, if you compare it to 2014, when before 2014 the Black Sea was more or less free and open. I mean, with the exception of the area that Russia took over after the 2008 war. With Georgia, but there was a lot of it wasn't 2014 was really the break there big time. And so we wanted to sort of describe exactly kind of how that actually had happened. In fact, and then we also wanted to deal with this question of some of the narratives out there. You used the word, the phrase, Mihailo, the Russia that Black Sea had become a Russian lake. Now this phrase was quite common out in the discussion, and we wanted to kind of deal with that to the extent to which it was true. Because some people would argue that it was a Russian lake and a Turkish lake, but then there was also a Romanian part and a Bulgarian part. So dealing with that issue, to what extent was that narrative true? And then of course there's also this narrative that was gaining ground that Ukraine was winning the Battle of the Black Sea, which of course is actually objectively true in the sense that if you look at the successes that Ukraine has scored over the last in the last 2 years, it's really quite extraordinary. In fact, I don't know. I wonder whether the percentage is actually 30% or maybe even it's even higher now because of the successes in the last few weeks. But anyway, the point is that to deal with this whole question of to what extent is Ukraine winning the Battle of the Black Sea, because of course there are undeniable and major successes, and then also. But also to remind people that there are an awful lot of assets, Russian military assets, that are left in Crimea. And so you can't sort of like, okay, some of the ships have been moved, or many of the ships are either sunk or damaged or have been moved to Novorossiysk, but there are an awful lot of other assets that are still left, military assets that are left on the Crimean Peninsula, and to sort of remind people of what actually still is there, and what needs to be made untenable or neutralized or otherwise. And then also to spell out for a U.S. audience the implications of a Russian victory in Ukraine, because if the war goes Putin's way, then people need to understand what's at stake, and it's not just the maritime domain; it's the entire Black Sea region. It spills into all the littoral states. And it goes much deeper than just what's actually happening on the water itself. So to remind people of that, and then also to remind again what happens when the West shows weakness or when the West shows neglect, because these both impact how Russia behaves. And in both cases, I would argue that there was some weakness demonstrated and some neglect demonstrated, which of course opened up many other factors, of course, contributed to this, but those being also significant. And I also wanted to, and then this also gets to your point about the U.S. Black Sea strategy. I wanted to comment on that as well. So there's some text in the paper or in the pamphlet, what would you call it? This is, I guess, report. It's not a paper. It's like this thick. Sorry, it's 100 pages long. But there's some language in there. There's a section in there about U.S. Approach towards the Black Sea region, the Black Sea itself, and the Black Sea region. So to actually comment on that as well, because there was an important, the Assistant Secretary for European Eurasian Affairs testified at the Congress last October about the Black Sea strategy, and to actually comment on that. And then, so the point is just that all these issues are to deal with all these issues in one place, and many of which were not necessarily covered in elsewhere. So I would argue maybe some of the three takeaways. So if you had to just if you don't want to read the 100 pages and you just want to or look at all the maps and et cetera and the tables, et cetera, what are the takeaways? Okay, the one takeaway is the Battle of the Black Sea is not over. It's in a different phase right now from what it was in 2022, say for example, or earlier. But the point is it is not over. Number one. Number two, that as the Black Sea goes, so goes the entire Black Sea region. So if the Black Sea, if Russia wins or ends the war on its terms, which continues to control Crimea and a significant part of the northern littoral of the Black Sea, then that's going to have implications far beyond just the water, just the maritime domain. And so to kind of so this is actually. Connected to a lot of other, a much broader region, and to sort of kind of articulate that. And then the third issue I could was what a comment that the former Bulgarian ambassador in Washington used to say all the time. Tigran Rasoichev, who used to say that what happens in the Black Sea does not stay in the Black Sea. So as people focus either on the maritime domain or whatever on the land part of the war, then I mean that this actually has much broader implications for a much broader area than one would than one would think. So the point is you have Russia has long been interested in the Black Sea and the Black Sea region. And in terms of, including after 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and when everybody thought the region was kind of sort of peaceful, well, no, there were frozen conflicts that arose. There was all sorts of mucking around in Ukraine, interfering in Ukrainian internal affairs. So this idea that somehow the Black Sea was a kind of a peaceful area is not really true. I mean, it was the absence of war, but there was a lot of Russian activity there, interference, etc. And it will remain. I think the whole region will be contested until Crimea is, or until Crimea is made untenable for Russia, because that area, that geopolitical space, that territory remains so critical to Russia's ability to define what happens in the Black Sea region, even if it's not able to. To patrol the seas per se, because it has a lot of other assets on that peninsula which can be used against whatever the littoral states or otherwise. And then of course Ukraine is scoring very substantial gains, but there are an awful lot of assets that are still left on Crimea, and I think people need to remember that, because it's going well for Ukraine in the maritime domain, but there's an awful lot left in that can be used, that is being used, probably as we speak, to missiles that are being sent at Ukrainian apartment buildings, schools, whatever, energy, you name it, Ukrainian targets. And so people have to sort of this is it's going to be a long time until the area returns to anything approaching the status quo ante pre-2014. And then you have also such things as the war will probably, while the maritime domain is going well for Ukraine right now, the war it will probably be determined more on the in the land domain and in the air. So it's what Ukraine is doing is really impressive in the maritime space, but also there are other we have to think about those other aspects as well, and because all the assets that Russia still has on Crimea. So anyway, these are sort of things that we wanted to deal with, so that if you don't want to read all the entire 100 pages or even the executive summary, there you have some of it right there. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Right then, so our short but concise discussion ends here. But before we conclude, join me in a warm round of applause for our panelists.
So we are, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. It is a pleasure to have you here in the room, considering the time and considering that there are much more distractions outside, as far as I hear, wine and that sort of stuff that you don't like. So thank you for keeping up with the discussions, and thank you, dear guests, for joining me on a very important topic which has to do with the economics of this war. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome a dear friend that I had a couple chances to be on to share a stage and other chances to share good discussions aside conference rooms. Mr. Andrei Larionov, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., and former economic advisor of President Putin, but also a prime minister of Russia, with a lot of experience in Russian economy and global economy, I might say. And joining us today is Mr. Igor Burakovsky, head of the board of the Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting in Ukraine, that I very much welcome because we have the two stories on an important topic, as I've said, Western sanctions and social economic effects on the Russian Federation. So, that being said, I will start with a main question that has been on our mind since the very beginning of this war. How effective are the Western sanctions? That's, the sort of question that we kind of hear always. And I know we have tried to answer this many times. So I would like you to comment on what should be done and whether sanctions are a good solution, considering the point that we are now in the war, and also considering the restructuring element of the global economy that we have to face. Many things that were said today also with Mr. Rubini, but also things that I kind of mentioned passing during the last panel. So I'll start with my right and then go forward towards my right, because that's all I have tonight, so only right. Please.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this very thought-provoking and very challenging in intellectual way event. And of course, actually, I'm especially grateful to the people who managed, to break this vicious circle of eating, drinking, and came actually for this particular session. Well, I'm not going actually to elaborate a lot about the sanctions. Well, I just would like to share a couple of thoughts with you, take into account Ukrainians' experience and my, so to speak, professional analysis of the sanctions. I'm not going to talk about the impact of the sanctions upon Russian economy because Andrew Larionov knows much better. But then maybe in the course of our discussion we could come back to this particular point. So just a kind of a couple of points like PowerPoint presentation. Well, first of all, actually, when it comes to the goals of the sanction, there are two major goals. Political one is actually to contribute to the change of the regime, or at least actually to make the regime to change its policy. And second aim of the sanction is to undermine economic capacity to wage the war. Frankly speaking, I do not believe in changing the regime in Russia at the moment, and as economists, I think that we need to concentrate on the issues of, undermining the economic capacity of Russia to wage war. Point number one. Point number two. When it comes actually to the sanction, actually we encountered quite a big challenge. It's really difficult to exclude from international economic relations such a big country as Russia. First of all, because it's a big resource supplier to the international markets, and second, because right now actually it's one of the major markets for a number of international companies. So it's a big market for consumers, it's a big market for technologies, etc., and definitely actually sanctions has its own price. Problem number three. Well, from my point of view, actually, what actually bothers me pretty well, that at the moment, pretty much that at the moment, no other countries except our allies will join the sanctions Rammstein, let's put it in such a way. Well, it means that actually, it's not so easy, in diplomatic way, to arrange a kind of support for the sanctions, and it draws actually, another conclusion, that secondary sanctions should play much more bigger and much more important role if you would like to have to increase the sanctions impact. Two more points, or maybe three more points. Well, at the moment, actually, from my point of view, the sanctions are rather limited in geographical scope. Well, not in geographical, actually, in product scope and in industry scope. First of all, we are talking about depriving Russia an opportunity to buy double-use technologies, military goods, etc. That's okay. Of course, actually, we could talk about diamonds ban. We could talk about price ceiling for the oil and oil products. But still, there is a number of sacred cows. Rosatom, first of all, actually, Rosatom consists of 420, if I'm not mistaken, different entities. And so far, actually, only 20 entities are more or less under the sanctions. And first of all, we are talking about the entities which are doing some research, some, so to speak, consultants, etc. And of course, it's not enough. When it comes actually to the efficiency of the sanctions, I just know to switch from economy to military. If the military field, my point is quite simple, that actually the sanctions should be combined with Ukrainian attacks upon a critical infrastructure in Russia. It means that, first of all, it would definitely undermine the economic capability of Russia to wage the war from one side, and if we take into account sanctions against supplies, for example, of oil processing, equipment, etc., so definitely this combination of military activities and economic sanctions is something which is actually to the benefit of Ukraine. My last point is quite simple. Actually, the sanctions are not sanctions have their own price. Definitely, in this particular case, definitely we should understand that our allies will need to increase the efficiency of institutional capacity to impose sanctions and actually, to prevent the circumvention of the sanctions. Well, definitely, I'm not going to give a lot of, advices what to do, but actually, from the history of NATO, for example, I'm just actually recollecting, very interesting institution which was called Coordination Committee, COCOM. So why not to resume this type of the practices? And that's all for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrei. How has the Russian government adapted to the sanctions? I know that every time we meet, we kind of come to an agreement that sanctions are not really working and we need more. We probably disagree in the details on what exactly is needed.
Really?
Sometimes. But my question today is, where are we in Russia? How has the Russian government reacted? And what's the repercussions, if I may?
Thank you, Antonia, for your question. Thank you for New Strategy Center for inviting me here. And thank you, all of you, for coming so late to listen to our boring talks about economics.
Very interesting point.
The main question that has been raised about the effectiveness of sanctions, of Western sanctions imposed on Russia, and it depends certainly on the point of view. So it will take one point of view of those who of those intentions that have been announced 2+ years ago. So from the West, it is spectacular failure. If we will look from the point of view of Mr. Putin, it is spectacular success. Let me try to provide you with some numbers just to understand what really happened over these 2 years and 3 months since full-scale invasion of Russian troops against Ukraine. So certainly we do need to understand that there are 3 types of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. First type is macroeconomic ones. The other one is sectoral ones, and another one is personal against some particular individuals. Let's start with macroeconomic sanctions. When those sanctions have been introduced, even before, we do remember that the President of the United States promised so-called sanctions from the hell if Putin would move his troops to Ukraine. Some other statements have been made, so we still remember them. What were the estimates of potential decline of Russian GDP as a result of introduction of macroeconomic sanctions? I still remember International Monetary Fund, World Bank, Institute of International Finance, many very well-known, well-regarded and well-respected economists, including some of those who presented this conference, made prediction that Russian GDP would decline by 10%, some 15%, 20%. Some people even then gone up to minus 30%. What was reality? In year 2022, Russian GDP declined by 1.2%. Last year, 2023, it grew 3.6%. 3.6% is the highest economic growth in Russia since year 2008, year 2009 economic crisis, putting aside this recovery from COVID. So that is why it's the best performance over the last 15 years. If we look into the international comparison, there is not a single G7 country that did grow so fast as Russia last year. Just once again, let's think about that. Since full-scale invasion, the Western countries introduced more than 18,000 of different sanctions. With sanctions imposed against Russia before February 24th, 2022, it was, if I'm not mistaken, some kind of 2,800 altogether. It is almost 23,000 of different sanctions. Never before in the history of humanity, so many sanctions have been introduced against any other country. Even today, the second most sanctioned country is Iran. It has only 5,000 sanctions, just to give you some kind of sense what is the difference. So with all those sanctions, so as I mentioned, the Russian economy last year performed better than any G7 country. It will take in cumulatively Year 2022, year 2023, and expected growth in 24, according to the IMF forecast. So Russia is going to be, for these 3 cumulative years, Russia is going to be second, or maybe even the first among G7 countries in terms of economic growth. If we look into the situation with real exchange, actual exchange rate, market exchange of ruble against foreign currencies, in year 2022, ruble became the best performing currency in the world. It appreciated, and appreciated substantially versus all currencies, including US dollar, euro, Japanese yen, Swiss franc, and all others. If we look into the foreign exchange reserves, just before the invasion, the Russian foreign exchange reserves stood at level 640 billion US dollars. As we all know, about 300 billion US dollars of Russian reserves assets have been frozen in Europe, in the United States, in some other places. What has happened with reserves? Within 2 years, 22, 23, Russia was able fully recover all this amount with a positive balance of payments that happened in 22 and 23. In 2022, the positive balance of payments for Russia was $240 billion. Unbelievable, unthinkable. It is absolute record in the history of Russia, maybe in the history of world economy. Last year, it's the positive balance of payments was slightly lower, but together with these 2 years, all losses, all frozen assets in Europe, in the United States, everywhere, have been fully replaced and recovered with a positive inflow of foreign capital into Russia. If we look into the social indicators, just look into the numbers. The retail turnover, one of the best short-term indicators for living standards, is growing about 10% in real terms annually. This is a booming consumption in the country. If we look in the real wages, it is 10% increase in real terms. Services in real terms increased by 5%, and so on and so on. If we look into the level of unemployment, it fell to the lowest possible, just historical level in history of Russia, 2%. So I can continue with all the statistics, and the very fact is that in terms of macroeconomic situation, Russian economy now probably in the best shape over the last, I would say over the last 15 years, since the booming years of the early year 2000s, and certainly better than any other crisis time. There is no talk about any crisis, or not about any decline. Certainly better than any other G7 country that are imposing those sanctions. So the main yes, if we look for the second type of sanctions, so-called sectoral sanctions, introduced against particular companies or particular industries or particular products, for example, chips or machinery or equipment. So we know the statistics. Number of think tanks published their reports, according to which Russia does import about $1 billion a month. All these military stuff, all these components that have been used in the Russian military equipment that is being used against Ukraine. $1 billion a month via a number of post-Soviet countries like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and others. Certainly a lot goes via China. All attempts or maybe just there is no much attempts to control this flow of military equipment or equipment of dual use. As for third type of sanctions, personal sanctions, we have seen that at the very beginning in the year 2022, number of some kind of well-known people, including business people, left Russia and have denounced aggression against Ukraine. It was 2 years ago. Since then, there is no a single case. Moreover, some of those so-called oligarchs or big business people who some kind of were thinking about to leave Russia and to relocate to the West, like Mr. Friedman and Mr. Avin from the Alpha Bank, after spending about 2 years in between, returned to Russia. And now they are filing, for example, cases against Ukraine, against Luxembourg, and against other places. So instead of dividing forces of aggressor, all those sanctions led to consolidation of resources and forces around aggressor. So it will take all these together. We absolutely obliged to ask, first of all, ourselves, why that happened? Who should be responsible for this result? And we need to be honest with in front of ourselves. Certainly, we do understand that sanctions, it is not the tool that can be used to win the war. There is no case in the world history the sanctions could be the most important factor to win the war. But sanctions can be used to limit resources of the aggressor, to sort of decrease resources that can be used for further attacks. It is not the case. The sanctions that have been introduced from year 2022 gave Putin extra resources, windfall profit in year 2022, $430 billion US dollars. Once again, just in 1 year, $430 billion US dollars extra profit has been given to Putin, not only due to sanctions, but sanctions did contribute to that. In year 2023, it is another $154 billion US dollars as windfall profit. And in this year, 2024, it is expected, according to the IMF calculations, another $214 billion US dollars and windfall profit. Just for comparison, all resources that the West has given to Ukraine as military aid and the budget support, in year 2022, $53 billion US dollars, in 23, $63 billion US dollars, and this year about 16. So altogether, Ukraine has received, once again, through all channels, from United States, from Europe, from other countries, $130 billion US dollars. Russia received as windfall profit for all these 3 years almost $800 billion US dollars, 6 times more. And the question is, if such situation continues, if those trends will continue, how long Putin could continue his aggression against Ukraine? The answer is very simple. As long as it takes. Forever. Because this is not only starting point, it's not about the potential, economic, military potential, Russia versus Ukraine. This is the flows. And this is flows is a result of sanctions organized in such a way that those sanctions are providing Putin with resources, roughly speaking, 6 times more every time period than the West collectively provides to Ukraine.
Well, I have a problem with forever, I have to say that. But given that I have here another expert on economy and world economy, where do you see the loopholes? Where do you see those elements that basically turned around whatever we intended with the sanctions? And first of all, is our intention to fix on the short term or the long term? How do you see the balance from our side this time? How are we adapting?
Well, I would like to say that when we're talking about the sanctions and their impact upon Russian economy, we need actually, well, at least, well, to keep in mind two things. First of all, that actually the figures of GDP growth, well, could be attributed actually to high state spending. Well, that's something we should be taken into account, and of course, actually, the structure of GDP actually, well, is, you know, well, deviating from the normal structure of GDP. It shows actually, well, the amount of the products and services generated by the economy. But again, we do understand that we're coming to a traditional economic and political dilemma: bread versus munitions, or versus guns, or butter versus guns. This is point number one. Point number two, actually, when it comes actually, well, for the money coming back actually to Russia, well, definitely, well, there is a question actually how to make, well, how to take steps in order to prevent this money going, well, to service the war and the military needs of the country. I mean, first of all, actually, well, Russia. And this is quite a big point. Point number three, well, definitely, actually, it seems to me that, well, behind the figures, we need also, well, to understand that, well, Russian high-level executives, first of all, from the government and from the central bank, they're quite efficient in terms of, you know, well, devising different schemes, how to avoid or how at least actually, well, to minimize the impact of the sanctions. But at the same time, if you're reading the political documents produced by the government and first of all produced by the National Bank, actually, well, they're talking that actually, well, the sanctions is something which bothers them, and that's something which plays a certain role. In this particular way, actually, I completely agree with Andrew Larionov that. At the moment, actually, well, the sanctions, well, the efficiency of the sanctions leaves much to be desired, and of course, actually, sanctions itself could not actually ensure the victory of Ukraine. This is a very important point. When we are talking about economic sanctions, it should be taken as a package. Economic sanctions, political support, or actually political solidarity with Ukraine, and of course, actually, well, military support and economic support to ensure Ukrainian economic resilience. Today we were talking about actually the economic recovery, but from my point of view at the moment, we need to make more accent on the economic resilience of the country, take into account there's a switch actually to another stage of the war, which is called the war of attrition. When it comes actually, well, to what should be done, well, definitely actually, well, I think that, well, we all together actually will need, well, the sanctions should be designed as a kind of package, and not only, you know, well, just to take, well, some steps or some measures, well, to reduce something, to actually, you know, well, to cut some supplies, etc., but also actually, well, to include in this package is also, well, the some, so to speak, well, subsequent sanctions, understanding that these sanctions would be bypassed. Point number two, actually, well, definitely, well, from my point of view, our colleagues from pro-Ukrainian coalition, well, let's be frank, actually, well, they lack institutional and actually, you know, well, in a way, actually, organizational resources actually to conduct well, the sanctions policy. It's true. It's true, and definitely in the times of globalization, it's really difficult to know, well, to think and actually, well, to pursue effective sanctions policy against the country, which is Russia. My point is quite simple, actually, that, well, actually, in the short run, well, definitely, actually, the sanctions will, in a way, make Russian economy to adjust to sanctions, and they should be taken as granted. This is point number one. Point number two, but definitely, actually, in medium term and long term, the sanctions would actually, you know, gather its toll. But again, actually, well, I do agree with the point that, well, sanctions itself is not enough to win the war. Is not enough, actually, well, to change regime priorities in Russia, and of course, actually, it has nothing to do with further democratization of Russia. Unfortunately, this is the economic realities, and they should be taken properly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If I may just follow up to my friend and colleague Igor. So I think it's a very widely shared and wrong explanation of the so-called success of the Russian economy under sanctions when people are trying to attribute to this reasonably good shape of the Russian economy as a so-called growth of the government expenditure. It is not the case. essentially there is no increase in government expenditure. By this indicator, the share of government expenditure in GDP, Russia has the smallest government sector compared to any G7 country. Once again, it is now 37%, which is lower than any other G7 country. Second, it did not increase over the last 3 years. So this is I would put it as kind of, it's like almost a miracle that by waging the war, especially what kind of war we can see, Putin and his team were able to wage this war by not increasing too much the share of government expenditure in GDP. Moreover, if we look into the other macroeconomic statistics, basic macroeconomic statistics like a size of budget deficit in GDP, it is best compared to any G7 country. The debt level as a share of GDP, it is by far the best among G7 countries, compared to G7 countries. In Russia, it is 20%. In most other countries, 60, 80, 100, in Japan more than 200% of GDP. And this is an important element of explanation of this success. So Russian economy, in terms of the so-called market credentials, looks like much more market one or marketized than any of G7 economies. It is a substantial portion of explanation why it is able to withstand this pressure from sanctions. In terms of the explanation why that happened, what we observe right now, the main reason is a completely wrong mindset of those people in Washington, in Brussels, who introduced those sanctions against Russia. Even that issue has been discussed extensively in February, March 2022. And since then, just when the first results of this so-called sanction policy became evident, there was among economists a very hot debate that the approach that has been taken by the Treasury, US Treasury and Brussels bureaucrats towards sanctions is wrong. Nevertheless, they kept continuing this policy. What is wrong in this approach? If we look into the history of sanctions against any other country over the last century, so essentially it was sanctions against export of those countries, whether it is Cuba, whether it is Iran, whether it is Venezuela, whether it is North Korea, and so on. This is probably the first time in the human history the sanctions have been introduced not against Russian export, and not especially the most important elements of the Russian export, like oil, gas, oil products, and so on, but against Russian import. They succeeded. They really succeeded in substantial reduction of Russian import. But because Russian export has not been affected, so they created huge positive trade balance. As a result, huge positive balance of payments that supported the exchange rate, ruble exchange rate, that supported and filled in foreign exchange reserves, and that gave powerful boon to the Russian economy. So from macroeconomic point of view, it was absolutely clear that such an arrangement of policies should be and must lead to economic boom. They achieved it. They succeeded. They confirmed that economics does work. But they applied economics that supports economy of aggressor. So the main idea from the very beginning, from February 22 and even earlier, was to do in opposite way, to address export of aggressor. And it could be in different ways, certainly not with this price cap that cannot work in the market economy. It is different ways, either to introduce embargo, the fuller embargo the better, or to introduce tax, energy tax on all Russian energy export and maybe on all Russian export. Collecting proceeds from this taxation to redirect to Ukraine to use those resources up to Ukrainian authorities and society to support reconstruction, to support budget, or to use for military purposes.
Okay, you said you wanted to have a reaction to that?
I would like actually
Please.
to react, so we have a kind of mutual enhancing discussion, which is very important. Well, I would like actually, to name a couple of points. Definitely, this type of discussion requires a special session actually to talk about Russian economy and shape and what the special is here. But my points are actually quite simple. First of all, actually, when we are talking about Russian military expenditures, we need to take into account not only absolute figures, for example, the ratio between the state expenditures and GDP, which is very important. I do agree with Andrew. But actually, my point is that we need to talk about redistribution within the budget and the redistribution of the expenditures. It's very important. Point number two, actually, Russian economy today is witnessing a kind of problems with the labor force, labor shortages, etc., etc. I do not believe in official statistics, but I read a lot of studies done by Western and not only Western companies about that something which show that the economy has some problems. And actually, when it comes, it would be kind of maybe summing up, taking into account the level. Well, I do agree that actually from the very beginning, the major, maybe not a mistake, again, actually, I'm not a political scientist, that's why I would like to avoid these, political cliches, actually. Definitely, the sanctions need to be taken as a package, and there should be a kind of a shock sanctions approach. Unfortunately, we see the evolutionary approach. So we do remember actually all the discussions about price cap when it comes to oil and oil products. Actually, we do remember all the discussions about some other goods, etc., etc. And of course, it gave enough time to Russia to adapt and at least actually to take some measures. So evolutionary approach is okay from the political point of view, but fortunately it gives time and some actually opportunities to adapt to a new external environment. Thank you.
Before wrap up, and talking about redistribution and the way we are looking at the numbers, but also at the reality, I'd like to ask Andrei, because I also hear lots of interesting story. The last one I heard coming out from Russia is, food, we adapted to the Russian products because Russian food is good, right? We don't necessarily need imports to make it work. But then there are other goods that are not really getting into the market and you have a black market for, besides the technology. For instance, makeup, good stuff, girl talk. So I hear that because of this redistribution between sectors, and because the war economy is basically fundamentally getting built up, there are sectors of the economy that have been affected by not necessarily the sanctions, but the restructuring of the Russian economy. And I'd like to ask you, what are those? And besides the problem of labor force, which obviously is an important one, is a key one to understand also military operations, but also economics inside Russia. And at the same time, we understand that Russia has a very specific element when it comes to labor force and understanding the Russian people, so we take that into account. But altogether, what are those sectors that have actually been affected by the whole situation? Not the sanctions, but the restructuring of the economy, as you put it.
First of all, we need to just, once again, before answering your question, just to remind this absolutely unbelievable number. About $800 billion as windfall profit went to Russia over the last 3 years. It is 43% of the Russian GDP in year 2021, before the full-scale invasion.
Sure, it's amazing, it's a miracle.
Yes. And it is higher than increase in GDP in any of G7 countries. So most of G7 countries that I have it here increased by 4%,
the G7
2%.
countries probably have better labor force right now.
8,
So
16, and for example, Japanese GDP declined by 50% just
Right.
by this.
Right.
So once again, just to understand, because of this huge inflow of real money, because it's international money, this is the US dollar, whatever, just because. So it allows Putin to use those resources, all the just like a Russian government, to do everything, to increase military expenditure. So now we have kind of announced so-called official numbers that Russian military expenditure is close to 7% of GDP, official number, plus FSB, Rosguardia, and so on, another 2% of GDP, which we know FSB and Rosguardia have been used in the war. So to very high extent, to a very large extent. So that is why, even according to official statistics, about 9% of GDP. So if we take into account the purchasing power parity compared to the, let's say, US or other Western partners that supply Ukraine with military, so that we can easily say that it could be at least 240 billion US dollars as being used annually right now for this year for military expenditures and expenditures related to that. So it's a huge amount. Plus, because this is, once again, it's 800 billion US dollars, it's enough to support all other sectors and provide the demand in other sectors. So we have some restructuring, and it's true. Some sectors, for example, retail is lacking personnel. It's a kind of the claim everywhere, so it's not enough. There is a huge increase in wages, salaries in the industry, especially in the military industrial sector, and this is a substantial increase not only in output, according to some data, which we should take with caution. Military output increased 5 times. So it's official data from Putin and other people, so that is for, not for all, but for some sectors. So we need to be really very cautious, but we definitely know, and it is, by the way, confirmed by Western intelligence services, including Estonian intelligence, British intelligence service, some others. So they are giving numbers close to this one. So that is why we definitely have a very substantial structural shift from so-called peaceful or civilian sectors towards military sector. As Igor has mentioned also, it's kind of the substantial labor shortages in the Russian economy, which is still not clear how to solve. Probably one more important point that I would use here, because probably we'll not have time and moment to discuss it, but I think it is very important. At one of the sessions earlier today, there was a discussion about the what kind of military force is better, conscript or professional. I don't think that is a correct some kind of division dilemma, because conscript could be for professional, voluntary could be non-professional. So, but what is important, that without exception of this mobilization that Putin called in September year 2022, and according to their data, it's probably 300,000 people have been mobilized. All other personnel went to the army voluntarily. So they're paying, and they're paying heftily. So initially they started to pay 200,000 rubles. It was about 2,000 US dollars, just lump sum. Now in many regions it went up to 5,000 US dollars, just lump sum, to 10,000 US dollars. So that is why it is remarkable that Putin's, regardless what is being told about him, about how he's restoring Soviet economy or Soviet approaches, in ideology, probably it was not Soviet, it's probably Orthodox or some kind of nationalistic, imperialistic, not Soviet. But in terms of economy, in terms of military service, it looks like he's still relying mostly on these kind of market mechanisms. And it is probably one of the explanations of this unexpected development with the Russian economy, the Russian military forces.
Well, thank you very much. I'm told by the organizers that I have to wrap up, but it was a very interesting discussion where we learned about the restructuring of the Russian economy. We learned about how Russia is better off considering the war economy than it used to be. Also, the statistics now need to be looked at carefully because obviously we do have a war economy on the one side and we have the West which only implemented sanctions and did not modify its economy in any way. We don't see any restructuring towards the war economy on our side. We still produce much of that retail stuff that is needed for a consumption economy in the West, and obviously comparing what we have with Russia is a bit, I don't know, not necessarily something we ought to do if we are real specialists, but considering the times that we are living, maybe we should back off from being real specialists and look at the political and geopolitical element of economy and try to fight better. So we need to be a bit more creative, right? More than we have been. Thank you very much. Thank you again for being here with me. It's always a pleasure to have such discussions. I enjoy these very much. Thank you.